Well, thanks very much. Hello, Edinburgh. Great to be here. Always good to be back in Scotland. Some of you may have heard me say on podcasts that I love it up here. I mainly love going up to the Highlands, but I will settle for Edinburgh. It's one of my favourite cities. And I've DJ'd here a few times back in the day, in a previous life, when I used to earn my living that way. I'm trying to remember the names of the venues. I know I was here for New Year's Eve 2001. There was a bar called Biblos. Anyone remember that? Yeah, I was there. I did the midnight set, New Year's Eve 2001, and I'd said to the promoter, I want to be on at midnight, because I thought it'd be crazy. Everyone in the venue would just go mad. And it got to midnight, and there was no bugger in the venue. Because everyone had gone out in the streets to watch the fireworks. I forgot. That's how you get down in Scotland. I also played a spot called Sportsters one time, and I think I played the Citrus Club one time. I'm just racking my brains. But yeah, lots of happy memories of DJ adventures up here. But these days I do rather different things, as you probably know. And this is the title of the talk for this evening. Yes, there is a literal in presentation. I have noticed that. Fire the proofreader. That's just to see who's paying attention. But overall, it's titled Music's Mind Control and Military Connections, which is what I talk about these days. For the past 15 years or so, I've been putting out books, doing public talks, doing podcasts on these kind of subjects. Along the way, this evening, we will be getting into subject areas such as lifetime actors, discovering what they are, the science of social engineering, the phenomenon of culture creation, and basically mass mind control through entertainment and popular culture. The overall dynamic can be summed up in the words of Edward Bernays, master propagandist, credited with having invented the art of public relations, of organisations, corporations, giving consideration to how they're thought about in the general public mindset. He was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, coming out of that particular bloodline family, so he knew a thing or two about how to manipulate the human mind. And in the opening paragraph to his book, simply titled Propaganda, published in 1928, he wrote, "We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." And that dynamic remains as true and relevant today as it was when it was written almost 100 years ago. What I've got here is a brief snippet of a documentary from a few years ago, which goes briefly into how Bernays was able to manipulate the American public mindset, because that's where he did most of his work, into basically buying a load of old shit that they didn't need through the clever use of psychology. Let's take a look at this.
Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires.
So it's all about the weaponization of psychology by those who comprehend very well how the human mindset works and therefore how it can be manipulated for malevolent means. This ties into another presentation which I've been doing a lot over the past few months, focusing on a particular organisation in London known as the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. There are many Tavistock companies all coming under that umbrella, and basically if you see Tavistock at the front of anything, it's bad news, unless we're talking about the town in Devon. It's not that I have anything against the town in Devon. A lot of people get that twisted, but this is the reason why I wear t-shirts bearing the slogan Tavistock Resistant, because so many of the social engineering psyops that get cooked up and used against us are created at Tavistock. There was a great book by Daniel Esterlin, which came out a few years ago, simply titled The Tavistock Institute, where he went into what goes on there. If we go into the background and the history of Tavistock, would you believe that there are connections to the world of the military? This will become a common theme this evening, and I'm glad you're all sitting down to recover from the shock of these endless connections into the world of the military and aspects of mind control. But Tavistock started out as an organisation known simply as Wellington House, and it grew up in the World War I years. From this biog we read that it's the more common name for Britain's War Propaganda Bureau, which operated during the First World War from Wellington House, a building on Buckingham Gate, a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence and nothing to worry about. Another great book was this one, which came out in 1991, written by Dr. John Coleman. It's called The Committee of 300, Conspirators' Hierarchy. And in it, he goes into the dynamic of the so-called elite ruling class that we have presiding over every area of organised society. He talks about the organisations through which they get the job done, and specifically he goes into the Tavistock Institute. Now, Coleman is someone who knew what he was talking about because he himself was a British military intelligence insider turned whistleblower. So at great risk to himself, he went public with what he'd come to learn during his years in the service. I believe he's still alive. I think he's in his 80s. He's still out there somewhere. He does the odd interview from time to time. But this was a great book. The unfortunate thing about it is that he didn't offer any citations or references. So he made a whole load of claims, and his critics were able to dismiss them by saying that can't be backed up, that can't be verified in any way. But one of the most interesting things that he stated was that the Beatles, which brings us our first link into the music industry, were a creation of Tavistock, used to foment social change during the all-important decade of the 1960s. We're going to take a look at that very shortly as a case study in how social engineering gets done. Very closely linked to Tavistock is the Frankfurt School in Germany. And it's through this organisation that we get the concept of cultural Marxism, a form of socialism. These days, it expresses itself as political correctness, or what in current parlance is known as wokeism. All that stuff, that way of thinking, was dreamt up at Frankfurt. It employed behavioural psychologists and social scientists who knew how to shape and mould the public mindset using Bernays-type methods. And the four key members of the Frankfurt School were Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Jürgen Habermas. The one we're most interested in is Theodor Adorno. And he turns out to have been a major player in the 1960s counterculture psyop, known alternatively as the hippie sort of flower power scene. Lots of social changes took place during the 1960s, particularly in America, but also here in Britain. And from this, we learned that Adorno was a key player at the Stanford Research Institute in the United States. So SRI is the closest thing America has to Tavistock. That's where the similar types of activities get rolled out on American soil. Out of that came the so-called Aquarian conspiracy. And this was named after the incoming astrological age of Aquarius, which was getting talked about in the late 1960s and was big news. It was part of the sort of hippie mindset of the time. People are still disagreeing now on whether we've actually entered the age of Aquarius, whether it happened those decades ago, whether we're still to go into it. Nobody seems to be able to agree on a date for when this thing is happening. But as part of this, the director of the Stanford Research Institute, Professor Willis Harman, produced a document titled The Changing Images of Man. And what happened in the 1960s was very largely based around that. So it was the merging of Eastern mysticism, which became very popular in those years, with music, changing fashions and trends and attitudes in society, and specifically mind-altering drugs. And that's why what went on in that decade serves as a masterclass 101 in how culture creation gets done. So very key to it, as I said, were the Beatles. Any famous musician or group comes with a Cinderella fairy story to explain how they became famous. When it comes to the Beatles, we're asked to believe that there were just 4 regular working class lads from Liverpool, put together a band, came up with a few catchy guitar riffs, wrote a few songs, punted around a few demo tapes, Brian Epstein took it down to London, got an audience with EMI Records, got them a record deal, and the rest is history, right? There's a bit more to it than that. The Beatles were pieced together in the way a boy band is in these times. So they effectively started out singing boy meets girl love songs. She loves you, please, please me, I want to hold your hand, all that sort of stuff. And they were a very different group in the early days to how they ended up in the second phase of their career. And the idea here was to build the fan base. They wanted to get people on board with this group who decided that they liked them, they liked their songs, they liked the catchy hooks, they thought they were 4 nice young lads. So that when they did the bait and switch, the big flip-flop halfway through their career, the fan base was already in place, they'd already decided that they liked them, and they were more likely to go in any direction the group led them, Pied Piper-like, because the groundwork had been done. And that's what happened. So in 1962, they released their first single, Love Me Do, released on the 5th of October in that year. It was the very same day that the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, was released. So we got 2 very British institutions, both of which have been responsible for pushing propaganda and the furthering of certain agendas through the decades, and both of them got launched on the very same day. So that was Love Me Do, and then by 1966, 4 years into that group's career, they'd started to change. They were sounding different, they were looking different. There was the track Tomorrow Never Knows, which was based around Dr. Timothy Leary's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which brings in the Eastern mysticism element to things. More on Leary shortly. And then by the following summer, 1967, the so-called Summer of Love, they dropped their Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, full of psychedelic, trippy sort of material, and it was clear they were a very different band. But the fan base pretty much got swept along with them, and it was all part of social changes which had been long planned and which were happening on both sides of the Atlantic. This was a part of the British underground, so-called, of the time. So there was a British variant on the counterculture scene that was coming out of California, largely centred around London, but with pockets of activity coming out of Oxford and Cambridge universities, which is where many of these social engineering psyops are also cooked up when it's not Tavistock. And this album was a part of it. So this was released in June 1966, so it was 666, which is a number that these occultists who run these industries, because that's what they are, seem to love. We'll be encountering that number again. And as we can see, it features the Beatles in white coats, covered with raw meat, dangled all over them, and mutilated baby dolls, with heads missing, arms missing, legs missing. This was said to have been an avant-garde art statement, because the London underground scene of the 60s was largely centred around avant-garde art, which pushed the envelope and, really challenged people to reconsider what art is. But there was an outcry at this album cover. People were outraged, rightly so. I feel it's communicating something to us, about maybe how the so-called elites of this world like to get down, and there would have been high-level knowledge on the part of some in the Beatles camp as to what it really meant. Anyway, this sleeve was very quickly withdrawn and replaced by another one. So next time you're scratching around in your attic and your garage, if you find an original vinyl copy of this album, you might want to stick it on eBay because it sells for several £100,000 at a time. Another group which was a big part of the 60s underground counterculture scene in London was the original incarnation of Pink Floyd, when they were known simply as the Pink Floyd. And this was in the time where the original frontman, Syd Barrett, was still in place. He was the singer-songwriter for the group, and he was there in their early days, the first couple of years, right up till they had their breakthrough hit singles in 1967. Pink Floyd were very much involved in pushing psychedelia and also LSD, plenty more of that to come, mind-altering drugs. They played at the UFO Club in London, which was a real focal point for that psychedelic culture at the time. And Syd Barrett had to be kicked out of the group just as they were breaking through to prominence in 1967. The official version of what happened to him is that he fried his brains by doing too much acid. The interesting thing is that Syd Barrett's father, and Syd's real name was Roger, by the way, whereas Roger Waters' real name is George. I hope you're paying attention, there'll be questions later. So Roger, Syd's father, worked for Cambridge University, connected to the British government, on research into mind control techniques. And I feel it's a fairly safe bet that his son, Syd, was used as a test subject in some of his experimentation. It would have involved the administering of mind-altering drugs, probably LSD, and that would be what happened to Syd, but he wouldn't have taken it recreationally. It would have been part of some sort of experimentation in a British variant on MK Ultra coming out of the CIA. So a few years after that, Pink Floyd underwent a makeover, and they recruited Dave Gilmour, grew out their hair, came with a different sound, a different look, and became best known for progressive rock of Dark Side of the Moon style and all this stuff. Because they'd done their job. They'd helped to push the culture that was relevant to the 60s, and it was time to move on to a new decade. But staying with the 1960s, because it's such an important decade and explains so much about where we're at now culturally, because so much of it had its roots in that particular decade, there were other kinds of public heroes. They weren't just rock stars. There were consciousness gurus. And one of the main ones was Dr. Timothy Leary. He was a Harvard professor, and he was kicked out of his academic role, so we're told, because he espoused his students using mind-altering drugs, LSD mainly, laboratory produced, but also more natural compounds like mescaline and peyote and psilocybin mushrooms, and encouraged them to go on these journeys of discovery and to expand their consciousness. I have no problem with anyone who chooses to do that of their own free will, so long as they cause no harm to anyone else. It can be a very beneficial thing, I feel, to expand your consciousness with some of these compounds. The point at which it becomes a problem is when it's occurring on somebody else's terms. So if you're getting coerced into experimenting with these kinds of products by parties of which you're not fully informed, there could be agendas at play, and that's where there's some potential danger. And this is what was going on in the 1960s with the young people of the time. So the youthful generation that the social engineers had in their crosshairs were known as the baby boomers. This was the generation that was born at the tail end of the Second World War. So they were coming of age in the mid to late 1960s, and they were absolutely rife for manipulation by the controllers behind these sort of agendas. So the mantra which Leary popularised was gifted to him by the writer, philosopher and advertising executive Marshall McLuhan, and it was turn on, tune in, drop out. What it meant was drop out of organised society, and specifically drop out of any kind of political activism. Because what was going on in these all-important years was that there was a lot of opposition from young people towards the Vietnam War, which was waging strong by this point. And the social engineers wanted young people taking acid, LSD, engaging in free love, free sex, which was a big part of what was going on in those times, and just getting stoned and going on trips and dropping out, not getting involved in any kind of opposition to the war or any of these other political movements and causes which were happening in the 1960s. That was the plan. Timothy Leary turns out to have been an asset of the CIA. By his own admission, in later interviews, he basically admitted to having been on the payroll. So this was a CIA-sponsored PSYOP. The LSD, which was turning up in seemingly unending quantities at all the hippie festivals and the music concerts and the gatherings in those times, was coming through CIA supply lines. The CIA is the biggest drug pusher on earth. They've been in breach of their charter pretty much ever since they were formed. They're not supposed to operate on American soil. They're supposed to only be concerned with overseas affairs. And the big joke is that Americans believe the CIA is there to keep them safe from harm, to represent their interests. What they don't realise is that it's the CIA which is responsible for causing the harm. And it's the same with British military intelligence as well. Military intelligence is, of course, an oxymoron. So, MI5, MI6, largely through James Bond, because people have been conditioned through those James Bond stories to imagine the British Secret Service to be this benevolent organisation with gallant heroes like James Bond that risk their lives to keep us all safe because they care about us. But we live in a satanically inverted society where everything is upside down and back to front, and if you want the truth of a matter, look in the 180-degree opposite direction to what you're being told by mainstream sources, and you stand some chance of finding it there. So British military intelligence is not there to keep you safe. On the contrary, it causes great harm. So it was the CIA pumping all these drugs into youth culture in the 60s. And another character responsible for that was a guy by the name of Ken Kesey. He was an author. He wrote the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was made into a movie starring Jack Nicholson, and it documented life inside a CIA MKUltra hospital. So MKUltra was this very far-reaching program of mind control, which officially ran from 1953 to 1973. And we're told that they wound it up in the 70s, and that was the end to all of that. Yeah, right. All that really happened is that it became a black op and went underground and off the books. If anything, I would argue that they ramped it up from that point on. But a big part of it involved what was going on with all these drugs, specifically LSD, in the 60s. So Ken Kesey used to ride around in this brightly coloured psychedelic bus with a bunch of his associates known as his merry pranksters. And they used to turn up at all these hippie music festivals and gatherings and such, distributing LSD and other kinds of drugs, entheogens, psychedelics. Their favourite thing was to put LSD into bowls of punch and then spike everyone in these gatherings. And Ken Kesey turns out also to have been an asset of the CIA. Is it just me, or is there a pattern starting to emerge here? Here's another one. So it wasn't just about rock music, it wasn't just about consciousness studies. The 60s were also about changing attitudes towards sex, relationships, and the family. So right around the time that all the drugs were coming on board and the music was changing and you had hippie ideals of peace and free love, you had the birth of the modern feminist movement. And that's credited to a woman named Gloria Steinem. Here she is. She was the proprietor of Ms. magazine. And that was all about women referring to themselves as Ms. rather than Miss or Mrs., so that nobody would know if they were married or not, in the same way that men just refer to themselves as Mr. But it was also about getting women into the workplace doing the kind of jobs that their male counterparts were. So the way it was sold to them was, hey girls, there's no reason why you can't be doing everything that the men are. We're just as capable as they are. We could be doing their jobs. So, get into the workplace and take on some of these professions. What that achieved for the social engineers was it got a whole generation of women out of the home, out of their traditional nurturing roles as mothers. They were putting their children into state so-called care, indoctrination, at ever earlier ages. It was breaking up the traditional family unit. It was destroying the cohesion and the unity that came from the family, with the additional benefit of contributing even more income to the taxation system in the United States. So as far as the psychopaths are concerned, it's a win-win-win. All these social changes, all happening at the same time. Can they possibly be a coincidence? All roads lead back to the CIA every time. Gloria Steinem turns out to have been on the payroll, on the books of the CIA. While we're talking about the CIA, one group which was very popular during those formative years and performed at many of these important music festivals was the Grateful Dead. Fans of the Grateful Dead have long referred to themselves as deadheads. So they'll go around saying, yeah man, I'm a deadhead. And they think it's a term of endearment. What they don't realise is that the controllers of organised society are, at their root, dark occultists, Satanists. They adhere to ritualistic practices and belief systems. I wish it was some other way, but the fact is, that's who we have presiding over the upper levels of every aspect of our lives. Not just entertainment and popular culture, but big business, academia, science, medicine, politics, everything. Every strata of society they've influenced through vehicles such as Freemasonry, but many others. And many of them are Satanists and dark occultists. And part of their religious outlook involves morbid mockery of what they see as the ignorance and the profanity of the masses. That's us, because they lump us all in together. They think we're dumb. They think we're ignorant. They think we're not worthy of spiritual knowledge. That's why they create terms like deadhead, because that's how they see us all, in their arrogance and their hubris. When it comes to the personnel behind the Grateful Dead, a delve into their family backgrounds and some of their affiliations does not disappoint. So one of the key members, Bob Weir, is a regular attendee at Bohemian Grove. So this is this area of redland forest in Northern California where once a year in the summer, the rich and powerful and famous gather together, put on robes, congregate in front of a 40-foot stone owl, take part in a ritual known as the cremation of care, and dance around a bonfire. I mean, we've all done it, right? Standard weekend, nothing unusual about that. Well, Bob Weir is an attendee at Bohemian Grove. He's spoken about it in interviews. So if the Grateful Dead are just this stoned out greaser sort of rock band, bunch of hippies, what the hell is Bob Weir doing rubbing shoulders with politicians and statesmen and judges and such at Bohemian Grove? Also in the Grateful Dead, we find direct links through the family members into Freemasonry, Harvard and Yale universities, aristocratic bloodline families going back many generations. We also find an interesting link which circles us all the way back round to Tavistock. Meet Eric Trist. This is who he was. As well as being born on the interesting date of September 11th, his profile reveals that he was one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute for Social Research in London. Why is this important? Meet Alan Trist. Alan is Eric's son. Alan Trist was a one-time road manager for the Grateful Dead, as well as being their music publisher. And he's the son of one of the founding members of the foremost centre of social engineering and mass mind control in the world. Incidentally, one of the previous road managers of the Grateful Dead was a guy by the name of Hank Harrison, who, as well as being a one-time asset of the CIA, it's a shock, I know, also turns out to be the biological father of Courtney Love, the partner of Kurt Cobain. And Hank Harrison himself stated that he believed his own daughter had been complicit in the murder of Kurt Cobain, because that was no suicide. A member of the 27 Club. Speaking of which, here's another one. Jim Morrison of The Doors. So if we're speaking about the 1960s and everything that went on, we cannot leave out the importance of Laurel Canyon. There's a great book which was put out 10 years ago now, 2014, by an author and researcher named Dave McGowan. It was called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. How many people here have read that book? A few of you, okay. Well, it definitely comes recommended. Dave McGowan was a regular kind of guy. He was a builder. He had his own construction firm. And he was a fan of 60s music. He grew up on all this stuff. And his interest was sparked by a book that he read on holiday one time about Laurel Canyon. And in this book, it revealed that in this neighborhood, in the Hollywood Hills overlooking Los Angeles, there was a covert military research base known as Lookout Mountain. This was a place where the American military and government used to produce propaganda films. They specialized in Cold War films. If you've seen footage of what purports to be what would happen to a house in the midst of a nuclear fallout, so you get a bunch of crash test dummies sitting in this sort of cardboard house in a landscape, and then they get totally obliterated. That film was produced at Lookout Mountain, and the purpose was to scare the bejesus out of the American public and to make them believe that at any moment the Russians could drop the bomb and that could happen to any of them. That's what they used to do at Lookout Mountain. And it was right in the middle of this neighborhood of Laurel Canyon. The reason it has relevance to the music industry is because for some reason, bands and musicians from all over America, every corner of it, congregated in Laurel Canyon from about 1965 onwards. So they were drawn magnet-like from all these different areas. There were also musicians from Canada that were coming down to Hollywood, and even bands from overseas, like the Animals from Newcastle, all relocated to Laurel Canyon. McGowan decided to do a bit of digging into the backgrounds and the family connections of these musicians. And what he discovered was that without exception, every key musician that was pushing these changing forms of music in line with these changing attitudes to sex and drugs and political causes and everything else had direct connections to the world of the military or aspects of military intelligence or other expressions of government. And these were high-ranking military officials, not just regular rank-and-file soldiers. Many, many examples. Frank Zappa is one. Many people view Frank Zappa as having been very anti-establishment and outspoken. Well, Frank Zappa's father was involved in chemical weapons research, developing bioweapons at the Edgewood Arsenal military base. The classic example that we were given was that of Jim Morrison of The Doors and his old man. So top left, we're looking at a picture of a young James Douglas Morrison in 1964, and he's on the bridge of his father's ship. That's his dad over on the right, Admiral George Stephen Morrison. His big claim to fame is that he was the Navy admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never actually happened. It was a false flag psyop dreamt up as justification for escalating America's involvement in the Vietnam War. So this was August 1964. Kennedy had been removed the previous year. Lyndon Johnson was in place as president. And as soon as Kennedy was gone, the Vietnam War was getting ramped up. But they needed an event to sell it to the American public. And they came up with this Gulf of Tonkin idea, the claim that a group of American ships was coming under fire by enemy forces, and that justified the escalation. The American military later admitted that that event never happened. It's on the record that it never happened. But the guy who presided over it was the father of Jim Morrison of The Doors. So by 1965, Jimbo had undergone something of a makeover. So he'd grown out his hair. He was now the front man of this group. The Doors had been formed very quickly. A whole bunch of songs were written. They'd come up with a look, a fashion, a sound. They were playing gigs. They were getting booked at music clubs. And Jim's up there on stage doing drugs, drunk, exposing himself, and ostensibly representing the angst of that youthful generation of the time. He was a poster boy for that generation. But how do we reconcile that with the activities of his old man?
But will the university be ready to meet his ambitions? Will his parents have been sufficiently interested in his future to have concerned themselves with the needs of their universities?
We regret to inform you that we are unable to accept your application.
Unless we face facts today.
Recognize anyone? So that's a young Jim Morrison in a commercial for Florida State University in 1964, the year before he emerged as the frontman of The Doors. So that was his acting gig in 1964. He's there with his short hair, looking very scholarly, with a college blazer and books under his arms. And then by the following year, he's lost the shirt, he's grown out his hair, and he's up there on stage doing all that crazy stuff, because that's his new acting role. In other words, Jim Morrison was an actor, and this is what we find so often. It's the sons and daughters of high-ranking military personnel who were put to use in social engineering agendas, because they like to keep it within tried and trusted families. I personally don't accept that Jim Morrison died when we're told that he did. So the official story is that 3rd of July 1971, he was discovered dead in the bathtub of his Paris apartment, another member of the 27 Club. I personally strongly suspect that Jim was allowed to fade off into a life of obscurity because he'd served his masters well and his role was complete. I think this is what we get with certain artists that we're told have checked out. Elvis Presley would be another one. Elvis had connections to the intelligence services. I document some of them in my first book. So when we were told in August 1977 that Elvis had died on the bog, at the age of 42, I personally don't accept that one either. I'm not saying that every time we're told an artist has died, it's not the case. I certainly do believe that some of them have been taken out. I think you have to look at each case on an individual basis and examine the evidence. But that's the strange situation with Jim Morrison. And people will say, oh, well, Jim was probably just rebelling against his father's value systems. Maybe he didn't approve of what his father was into. It's a possibility. And if that were an isolated example, maybe we could write it off as that. But what McGowan demonstrated through his book was that with every musician coming out of Laurel Canyon, we find connections through the fathers into these high-ranking positions. Generals, lieutenant colonels, admirals. Another example would be Bob Marley, who was not a Laurel Canyon musician, but his father, Norvell Sinclair Marley, was a white British naval officer. And he also owned and ran a slave plantation in Jamaica. Bob's mother was black. Now, this is why I say you need to look at each case on an individual basis, because I personally accept that Bob Marley was taken out. So we're told that he died on the 11th of May 1981 at the age of 36 of an extremely fast-acting form of cancer. And there's a story attached to that. So Bob Marley, I believe, was a genuine political activist and had really become a thorn in the side to the establishment. So in 1976, he was due to take part in a political concert aimed at uniting the two rival political factions in Jamaica. And shortly before that concert, there was an attempt on his life. So there was a drive-by shooting at his house, and it got peppered with bullets, and the intention was for him to die. He survived. He went on to perform the concert, but from that point on, he'd become a marked man. So I think he probably did rebel against his father's value system in a way that Jim Morrison didn't. The story gets more interesting when you factor in that Bob Marley took to living in a heavily fortified compound with security on the gate because he feared for his life by this point. And one day at this compound where he was living, a young filmmaker turned up, and he said that he wanted to make a documentary about him, and he'd bought him a gift as a gesture of goodwill. And the gift was a pair of football boots, because Bob Marley loved to play football. And according to those that were there, Bob put on the football boots and then cried out in pain. And when they examined one of the boots more closely, they found a length of copper wire protruding from one of the toe areas, and it had pierced his big toe. The official story of what happened to Bob Marley is that he broke his toe playing football, the toe became infected, and it became cancerous, and it eventually finished him off. What seems more likely is that these boots contain some sort of cancer-causing agent which had been put onto this copper spike, and that pierced his toe, and that caused the cancer that eventually finished him off. The young man who brought the football boots into his compound went by the name of Carl Colby, and he turns out to be the son of the one-time director of the CIA, William Colby. And while we're talking about fast-acting and aggressive forms of cancer, guess what happened to Dave McGowan, the author of that book on Laurel Canyon? So the book comes out 2014. By the end of 2015, Dave's dead. Contracted cancer, passed away on the 22nd of November, the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination in 2015. Similar to Tavistock is the London School of Economics, in terms of it being one of these think tank organisations which specialises in shaping and moulding public opinion, public thought, basically in training the populace in how to think about certain things, what attitudes to have, what behaviours to adopt, how to dress, how to speak. All of these things are dreamed up by Edward Bernays' men we've never heard of. So the LSE does similar stuff to that. Most graduates of the LSE go on to careers in law, business, finance, this sort of thing. You don't necessarily expect LSE graduates to become debaucherous, grizzled, hedonistic, drug-addled rock stars. But that's what Mick Jagger did. So Mick Jagger came out of the LSE and spent the next 6 decades and counting as the aforementioned grizzled old rock star. And he was pushing agendas all along. According to Dr. John Coleman, in that book, The Committee of 300, it wasn't just the Beatles who were a product of Tavistock. The Rolling Stones also came out of that organisation. And what we're looking at is a dialectic. They love doing this. Controlling both sides of a dynamic and giving people the illusion of choice, whereas it doesn't actually matter what anyone chooses because the result is the same either way. We see it in the two-party political system. Which do you choose, Conservative or Labour? Doesn't make a damn difference because the policies remain the same and the agendas continue to get pushed either way. And so it is with music groups. So with the Beatles, if they were a little too soft and a little too nice for certain music fans, if they preferred their groups a bit more edgy, a bit more dangerous, then fear not, the bad boys of rock, the Rolling Stones, are there to sweep up those people. But what if both groups are ultimately pushing the same agendas? So the same ideas get put into people's minds either way. So Mick Jagger in the video to Sympathy for the Devil was rocking eyeshadow and lipstick. So he's pushing androgyny, the blurring of the genders, that was going on way back then. More of it in the movie Performance, 1970. And the Rolling Stones, at the end of 1967, had put out their album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Catchy title, huh? This was 6 months after the Beatles had put out Sgt. Pepper to kickstart the Summer of Love of 1967, because that's when they really wanted to ramp up the sex and the drugs and the rock and roll and the whole counterculture, everything that 60s scene stood for. This album was an homage or a pastiche of that Beatles sleeve, and cleverly hidden in the elaborate design there are the 4 faces of the Beatles. So it's a little Easter egg clue to indicate that both groups were connected. And they were actually friends. People think they were rivals, but the Stones and the Beatles used to go out partying and socialising together, very far from rivals. We see these dialectics all the time. In the 80s, it was Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran. Girls in my school either fancied John Taylor at a Duran Duran or Martin Kemp at a Spandau Ballet, And then in the 90s, it was Blur and Oasis. Which one do you prefer? Doesn't matter. They're all controlled by the same forces. The 60s PSYOP served its purpose. I think it's fair to say that the ripples from the social changes fomented in that decade are still being felt now, all these years on. And the controllers wanted to nail the final nails in the coffin of that decade with a few events which they had up their sleeves. One of them was the so-called Tate LaBianca murders, or Manson-Tate murders, which are said to have taken place over the 8th and 9th of August 1969. The official story is that there was this crazy dude, Charles Manson, who was a hippie, and he had this sort of mind control cult with these followers, these disciples, and he enticed them to go on these murderous rampages on those 2 nights and kill a whole bunch of people. So the first night, it involved the actress Sharon Tate, who's said to have been 8.5 months pregnant at the time. She was the wife of the film director Roman Polanski, who had just directed Rosemary's Baby, which gives us some very valuable insights into Satanism and how that all works in society, and 4 others. So there were supposed to be 5 Manson followers that went up to this house, 10050 Cielo Drive, in the Hollywood Hills, very close to Laurel Canyon, just above the Hollywood Film Studios, and murder 5 people, brutally, horrifically. This event was broadcast all over the American media. The trial lasted another couple of years, and it completely traumatized the American public. The main purpose of that event was to portray hippies as murderous, crazy maniacs, very far from the peace and love ideals which genuine hippies stood for. I personally feel that the so-called Tate murders never actually happened. There's a paper which was put out there a few years ago by a researcher who goes by the name of Miles Mathis. And he goes into extreme detail in a very well-researched piece where he presents his beliefs that that event was staged using actors. Sharon Tate was an actor. Remember, it took place within a stone's throw of all the film studios in Hollywood, where there was ready access to extras, props, fake blood. And he makes a very compelling argument for that event never actually happening, but being another false flag psyop, just like the Gulf of Tonkin, to achieve certain goals. And the idea was to completely put to bed all those hopeful, rose-tinted ideals that hippies had in the 1960s, and just to demoralize that generation and leave them entering the 1970s completely dispirited, completely deflated. It's another thing that they kind of specialise in. I learned a lot about the dynamics of culture creation, social engineering, lifetime actors, how all this stuff gets done from these 2 researchers, Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill, who used to have a great podcast series called Unspun, going back a good few years now. The unfortunate thing is that Jan Irvin fell out with Joe Atwill when he accused him of being a CIA operative. But Joe probably shouldn't take it too personally, because Jan unfortunately ends up falling out with everyone he's ever worked with and accusing them of being CIA agents. The guy seems to be deeply paranoid. He evidently did a lot of psychedelics in his youth, and it seems to have affected his perceptions somewhat. But nevertheless, during the time that this show ran, Unspun, they put out some really great material. You can still find the shows online. They're very valuable. And this is where I got introduced to the concept of the lifetime actor. This is a term that was coined by Joe Atwill, and it refers to somebody who is in the public eye to the point that they've become a household name, and they're known for one thing or another. So they might be a famous musician, they might be a Hollywood actor, they might be a television presenter, they might be a celebrity chef, they might be a professional sports person. And the real acid test is if you went out on the streets of Edinburgh this evening and stopped 10 people and gave them a name of someone famous and asked them if they'd heard of them, if you get a 10 out of 10 back, they're a lifetime actor. So Mick Jagger, for example, if you stopped 10 people out there and said, do you know who Mick Jagger is? How many do you think would say yes? 10? I think they probably would. There are many other names that we could throw into the mix. And a great example of a lifetime actor comes from Bill Gates. Again, probably 10 out of 10 people would say they've heard of Bill Gates. Many would say, oh yeah, he's a philanthropist. He's a really nice man. He's a billionaire, and he gives loads of his money away to research into things like arm spears, because he cares. He's got a big heart. Whereas, people in this room would probably know Bill Gates for something rather different, and we might see him in a slightly different light. And we'd be right too, because when we go delving into his father and what he was into, we find that William H. Gates Sr. had been head of the Planned Parenthood organization, which had evolved out of the American Eugenics Society. An insight into the mindset of these people comes from Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood's founder, who said, the most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. And she described as human weeds, reckless breeders spawning human beings who should never have been born, in describing immigrants and the working class. Nice lady. So, eugenics is all about removing from society certain undesirable aspects and getting to decide which groups in society get to procreate and continue their genes and which groups should be bred out. It's a completely psychopathic mindset. So Margaret Sanger, who made those comments, worked alongside Bill Gates' father. One generation on, Bill Gates heads up the worldwide agenda in trying to coerce everyone alive, but not for much longer, into taking what the Sheep Farm lads. Anyone listen to Sheep Farm Studios? Yeah, got some Sheep Farm fans? Yeah. Rise Above? Anyone listen to Rise Above? Yeah. So anyone that listens to Sheep Farm will know what I mean when I say Brittany, 3-dart finish, right? Arm spear. See, I'm so used to making videos, which I want to put online, that I've entrained myself to speak in code these days. So I don't use certain words beginning with V because I just imagine it's going to lead to a video getting taken down. So I refer to arm spears and Britneys, So Bill Gates is out there trying to entice everyone into taking a Britney, a 3-dart finish. In the meantime, he's made no bones about the fact that he wants to significantly reduce the world's population. So what could possibly go wrong? A few months ago, I did a really interesting interview with a lady named Anne Diamond. Not her real name, not the British TV presenter. Her real name is Anne McLean. And she claims that she was part of the CIA's MKUltra experimentation program, mind control, operating out of the Allen Memorial in McGill University, Montreal, Canada. This was one of the most notorious hotbeds of MKUltra research. It happened under the watch of a completely vicious psychopath, one of the most notorious MKUltra doctors, Donald Ewan Cameron. He was a Scotsman, can you tell? And he went out there to Canada to head up this program. So Anne Diamond says that as a child, she was inducted into this program. Interestingly, she says that she's got memories of a young, pre-fame Mick Jagger being present in the Allen Memorial. And she says that back in those days, he was known as Michael. She also became the partner of Leonard Cohen, singer, songwriter, cultural hero of the 60s scene. He didn't even begin performing until the age of 33. Go figure. Any Freemasons in the house tonight? Scottish Rite? No? We're playing it low key, are we? All right. Okay. I'll watch for the hand signals later. So, Anne Diamond was with Leonard Cohen for some 20 odd years. And she says that in addition to him being a singer-songwriter performer, when he used to go around the world, ostensibly playing gigs, he was actually undertaking espionage missions on behalf of the CIA and Mossad. So we've got another connection between music and the military. Intel services. She says that Leonard had a habit of popping up in various parts of the world where a famous rock star was about to meet their demise. She says that in September 1970, Leonard showed up in London right before Jimi Hendrix was murdered, because that's what happened to him. The official story will tell you that he choked on some barbiturates, drowned in his own vomit. It's not what happened. He was murdered at the behest of his manager, a guy by the name of Michael Jeffrey, who was also a British military intelligence insider. Seemingly, it was all to do with his music publishing. They decided that Hendrix had become a bit of a loose cannon, and they stood to make shitloads of money out of him if he was out of the way, worth more dead than alive. So the plan was hatched to get rid of him. And from what I've heard, a couple of thugs from the Newcastle organised crime underworld were hired to come down to London and do the job. The coroner who performed the autopsy says that he was effectively waterboarded with red wine. His lungs were saturated with red wine. That's what happened to him. He was 27 years of age, another member of the 27 Club. So Anne Diamond says that shortly after that, Leonard left London. 10 years later, in December 1980, she says Leonard showed up in New York directly before John Lennon got assassinated outside the Dakota building. And directly after that event, Leonard left New York and holed himself up on a remote Greek island for several months. I'm going to play an excerpt from this interview here because she also had some interesting things to say about other aspects of what was going on at McGill as part of those MKUltra experiments, and these also connect right back into the world of rock music.
McGill was connected with Tavistock, okay?
Yeah.
And some of the psychiatrists who were programming patients, but I think particularly children at McGill in the 1950s were the same psychiatrists that, you know, they would have known either known or been the same people that were at Tavistock. There was an entertainment music connection, and part of what was going on at McGill in the centre of Montreal, which had been the jazz capital of Canada and North America, like New Orleans and New York, you know, was that they were programming artists and musicians in particular, because, you know, the Air Force owned EMI, the recording studio in London where the Stones and the Beatles recorded, mm-hmm. and they had developed a form of mind control programming using electronic signals, right? And they were expanding that. And the top psychiatrist, Dr. Cameron at the Allen Memorial, used to talk and write about how rock and roll music could be the vector of mental illness. He said you could create rock stars who were mentally ill, and then they could spread mental illness to a whole population, which was really his, goal, was to make everyone schizophrenic and controllable through drugs and different forms of, electronics and so on.
And she's absolutely right about those early record labels having connections to the military and having originally had military applications. So one example is EMI, Electrical Mechanical Industries, became the Beatles record label, but prior to that, it was engaged in military-grade research into radio systems and different sonic weaponry and radar systems and things of that nature. It's also the case with Parlophone, Decca, and also RCA, which became Elvis Presley's record label. RCA stands for the Radio Corporation of America, and it came directly out of the US Navy. So right before all these artists got launched at the start of the rock and roll era, their record labels had been involved in military operations. The LSE, London School of Economics, also produced another very well-known graduate in the world of music. This article asks, is Rick Stein related to Judge Jules? It should say, Rick Stein is related to Judge Jules, because Rick Stein, the celebrity chef, is the uncle of Judge Jules, the very well-known club and radio DJ. So this is a good example of different expressions of the same family getting put to use in prominent, influential roles in society. So in this case, you've got one strand of this family where the guy's been put out there as a very well-known celebrity chef, household name. Meanwhile, his nephew has become an extremely well-known DJ who was very instrumental in the pushing of the acid house rave scene in its very early days, which gave way to the worldwide explosion in electronic dance music and clubbing culture, which we'll get to shortly. But this is the way they do it. You cannot get to be as prominent as Rick Stein under your own steam. Try it. Try the experiment. See if you can get primetime shows on BBC TV. It doesn't matter if you're the best chef in the world. You could be 10 times as good as this guy, but you ain't going to get there if you don't come from the right family, or if you don't sell your soul in exchange for an engineered career. Because that's the way these guys get to the top. They decide who's going to be the top band, not the public. The Beatles were not necessarily the greatest band out there. There were many other bands that were way more musically proficient than them, but they were never going to get to the top because they weren't chosen ones. That's the way it works. We see from this article that Jules, real name Julius O'Riordan, graduated from the London School of Economics. And part of his job was to help get this whole scene going. So we spent a bit of time earlier looking at the 60s psychedelic, flower power, hippie scene, call it what you will. 21 years after that, on British shores, we got what is effectively a repackaging and a reboot of the same psyop dropped on a new generation. This time, it was my generation, Generation X. So the acid house rave scene got going in sort of 1987. We get this Cinderella fairy story of 4 DJs from London that went out to Ibiza and they discovered MDMA, ecstasy, for the first time, and they heard this DJ playing all this amazing music at Amnesia nightclub, and they were dancing open air under the stars and undergoing this amazing experience, and they wanted to bring it all back to London and recreate that vibe back home, on British shores. Then in 1988, we had what the mainstream media of the time dubbed the Second Summer of Love, which was a song by Danny Wilson. I was hanging out with the brothers from Danny Wilson yesterday in Dundee, who you might be interested to know are on our side and wide awake, so good lads. Yeah. So there are some. So the Second Summer of Love, that was the name that the media used for 1988 and 89, so there's our first clue that there's a connection between the two scenes. And there are so many parallels. So in the 60s, young people were being enticed to take LSD, and the LSD was coming in unending quantities. There was psychedelic rock music, which was coming along to replace what had been there previously. And there were hippie communes and gatherings and music festivals where these young people would all come together and share the same interests. In 1988 and 89, the same thing was happening in Britain. Only this time it was MDMA, or ecstasy, which was the drug of choice that had replaced LSD. It was new forms of electronic dance music, replacing what had gone previously. And it was raves, warehouse parties, open-air raves in fields, and then later in clubs, and the birth of super clubs like Gatecrasher, Ministry of Sound, Cream, brands such as that. But it was the exact same dynamic being dropped on a different generation. And in my view, what this was all about was popularising electronic dance music. It had to have its roots somewhere. It had to have that cover story for where it all came from. And long-term, electronic dance music has been used to glorify transhumanism, artificial intelligence, and electronic digital ways of doing things, a digital society. It's been preparing a generation for what they plan to bring in. You know, the smart grid, 5G controlled Internet of Things linked to a Chinese communist style social credit system and all the rest of it. United Nations Agenda 2030, the Great Reset by any other name. The acid house scene came with its own symbol. This was everywhere in the 80s, the smiley yellow face. And this was taken at the time to represent joy, fun, happiness, togetherness. That's how people perceived it. In recent times, the smiley has made something of a resurgence, but it's taken on some rather darker overtones. So a few months ago, we lost the Friends actor Matthew Perry, turned up dead in his jacuzzi, death by bathtub again. And shortly before that event, he pictures himself on his social media with this smiley yellow face cushion. So it's all starting to get a bit creepy. Right around the same time, we had the release of this track by DJ Pierre, who's one of the original producers from the acid house era in the 80s. And this was a remake of a track that he put out in 87 called Acid Tracks, produced in conjunction with a German DJ and producer by the name of Paul van Dyk. So we can see now the smiley has started to get a bit twisted and distorted. We've got the dripping paint. And in place of the eyes, we've got two slits. And they remind me of something. This is the logo that was used by the Schutzstaffel, the SS, out of Nazi Germany. Bearing in mind that Paul van Dyk is a German DJ and producer. This is a symbol, a sigil, that has been used for a few years by Paul van Dyk on his album artwork and things of that nature. And I couldn't help noticing that it does look rather similar in some ways to a logo that was used by British military intelligence, MI5, between the 1950s and the 1970s, when we put them together. So I wonder if there's a clue there as to this guy's affiliations. There's loads on Paul van Dyk. I'll be going much further into him in my next book. Also, there's a lot to know about the so-called smiley face killings. I did a show on these recently with an American investigative journalist by the name of William Ramsey. So there's been a large number of young men who've been turning up dead in very suspicious circumstances, and their bodies are always found in water, rivers, lakes, things of that nature. And in the vicinity is a smiley face which has been daubed in graffiti onto a tree trunk or a wall or a rock. And these murders have been happening all over America and also in Britain. So there is a dark side to the smileys. Let's just leave it at that. Any fad, any trend, any scene, any movement which sweeps up large numbers of people in its wake can be demonstrated to have been manipulated. Sadly, this is true of pretty much all of them. Many of these are bitter pills for people to swallow. This one was for me. As a DJ, when I was out there playing clubs for all those years, I primarily played rap, hip-hop, R&B, other forms of black dance music. So I was very much into hip-hop culture. And when you are, you're trained to revere three certain figures as founding fathers of the culture. So one of them is Kool Herc, who was the DJ who came out of a Jamaican family, who is credited with having popularized the use of turntables and sound systems in block parties. So hip-hop's just passed its 50th anniversary. It's said to have got going on the streets of the Bronx in New York in 1973. And Kool Herc threw many of those early parties where breakdancing would occur and turntablism and such. Another hero of the culture is Grandmaster Flash, who is credited with having invented the art of turntablism. This is manipulating two copies of the same record, scratching and cutting and creating very rhythmic transitions between the two records. And the third hero of hip-hop culture is a guy who goes by the name of Afrika Bambaataa. His real name for many years was said to be Kevin Donovan, but an investigative journalist in Chicago by the name of Layla Wills did some digging into who this guy really was. And she uncovered that his real name was Lance Taylor. And what do you know, overnight, after she'd revealed this information, his Wikipedia entry miraculously changed to reflect his real name. So the story is that he came out of the gang culture in the Bronx, New York. There was this organisation known as the Bronx River Organisation. Then it just became known as the organisation. There was also a criminal street gang known as the Black Spades, and they morphed into the Universal Zulu Nation. In 2016, two men came forward accusing Bambaataa of having raped them when they were underage lads, minors, back in the days of the Universal Zulu Nation. In the wake of that, several others came forward and also accused Bambaataa of having sexually molested them. And the Universal Zulu Nation leadership then distanced themselves from him in a big way. Despite that, he's still walking around a free man and nothing's happened to him. But it has raised many questions in my mind as to the origins of rap and hip-hop in the first place, albeit reluctantly. We can look at the names of some of these founding members of the culture. There's Grandmaster Flash. Grandmasters come out of Freemasonry, as far as I know. Then there's Grand Wizard Theodore, which sounds like something that would come out of the bloody Ku Klux Klan. So all kinds of questions about the origins of this culture. It's starting to unravel for various figures as well, casting even more doubts and raising even more questions as to what that thing was really all about. Sean Combs, known as Puff Daddy back in the day, P. Diddy, P. Dodie, P. Diddley, whatever the hell he's calling himself this week. So multiple accusations from women and men of sexual impropriety on his part. They're coming forward at an alarming rate. There's seemingly a new accusation every day now. So this guy would almost certainly have been implicated in the murder of Biggie Smalls, Notorious B.I.G., back in 1997, 6 months after the drive-by shooting of Tupac. So all his sponsorship deals are starting to unravel. Similar thing happened a few months ago to R. Kelly, the R&B singer. Multiple women accusing him of running effectively a mind control cult, a sort of sex harem. He's gone to jail. If Diddley stays out of jail, it will be a bloody miracle. Or it will indicate that he's got high-level protection, like this guy, Tim Westwood. So for decades, this guy has been the most prolific and influential radio and club DJ in the rap and hip-hop genre in the UK. I used to look up to him. He used to be a personal hero of mine. Not anymore. We live and learn. But back in the 90s, when I was aspiring to be a DJ myself, I respected the guy, you know. Here's his dad. This is the Reverend William Westwood, Bishop Bill. He was an Anglican bishop, the Bishop of Peterborough. And his son, Timothy William Westwood, was a public schoolboy. Came from a wealthy, upper middle class family, attended public school in Norwich, extremely exclusive, then became a rap and hip hop DJ with a show on Radio 1 lasting 19 years. Since 2022, multiple women have come forward and accused this guy of sexually molesting them. There's said to be 2 separate BBC investigations along with a Metropolitan Police investigation. So that will go well then. I think we already know the result. But it raises further questions about who this guy is. So many involved in the rap scene have suspected Westwood of being an implanted gatekeeper. So his job, when he was inserted into that scene, was to keep an eye on it and make sure it went in certain desired directions and to just be there to do the controller's bidding. Here's another one. This is David Rodigan, MBE, and he, for decades, has been the most prominent and influential DJ on the UK's reggae scene. So we've got 2 music cultures which traditionally come out of black communities, they're black forms of music, and we've got posh white public schoolboys as gatekeepers in both scenes. Rodigan's background is similar to Westwood's, public school educated, born on a military base in Hanover, Germany, trained as an actor, starred in episodes of the BBC's Doctor Who, before becoming a gatekeeper for the hip-hop scene, reggae scene. More of the same with Pete Tong, another DJ I used to look up to. He's been on BBC Radio 1 for decades, since 1991, and on his own social media, he refers to himself as the Pied Piper of dance. We've got another clue here, people. What did the Pied Piper of legend do? He led the children of a town astray, away from their parents, and off to their doom, their demise, through the use of music. He's telling you that he's a gatekeeper. Many of these fads, trends and scenes have their own venues, which go hand in hand with the changing culture. So, for example, with the new romantic scene, which came at the very start of the 1980s, it was one of those forms of music that came directly after punk and new wave. It was all about the Blitz Club in Covent Garden, London. That's where all the faces on the scene used to hang out. In the foreground, we've got Steve Strange, real name Steve Harrington. His father was a military guy, worked for the army. Steve Strange died at a relatively young age in some very strange circumstances. There's Midge Ure of Ultravox lurking in the background there. And these were the main faces on that scene. Boy George was a part of that as well. As were this group, big time, Adam and the Ants. So Adam Ant in the foreground there, real name Stuart Goddard. His father, as well as being a military guy, I know, shocking, was also implicated in a paedophile ring and went to jail for it. And this group had affiliations to Jimmy Savile. Adam Ant's mother became a cleaner for Paul McCartney, 2.0 presumably. Billy Shears, that's a separate presentation. We'll maybe get to that in part 2. But Adam Ant has always shown traits of having been very heavily mind controlled. And the way they sell that to us is by saying that he suffers from bipolar disorder. And this is used to explain away some of his very bizarre behaviours and the fact that he keeps going in and out of rehab and hospital, which are euphemisms for MK Ultra style mind control hospitals. And another scene which bears all the hallmarks of having been completely concocted and completely manufactured was the Britpop thing in the 90s. Cool Britannia, all of that. So here's Noel Gallagher, you know, that dangerous, rebellious, you know, rock star, hanging out with Tony Blair, sipping champagne at number 10, like you do. And what this one was all about was, believe it or not, trying to make Tony Blair palatable to the youthful generation of the 90s in time for that general election on the occult significant date of 1st of May, Beltane, 1997, when New Labour was swept to victory, kicking out the dusty old Conservatives. The way had been paved for that through the construction of the Britpop scene, Cool Britannia. The idea was that Britain was undergoing this cultural resurgence. It was the most exciting times since the 60s. You had Blur and Oasis and the Spice Girls and Pulp, and it was great. Chris Evans on the Radio 1 breakfast show, and it was cool. And Tony Blair was this visionary young leader in touch with the youth, used to be in a band himself, played a bit of guitar, used to smoke a couple of spliffs, you know. He's down with the kids. He's the man you want, with his bright toothpaste smile, and it worked a treat, you know. Things can only get better. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Featuring Professor Brian Cox as the keyboardist in that band, by the way. Yeah, D-Ream. I'll leave you to look up what reaming is when you get home later tonight. So what this was all about was getting Blair into office in 1997 so that he was there ready to preside over the ritual murder of Princess Diana later that year. In 2001, he got a second term so that he was in office ready to preside over the events of 9/11. And in 2005, he got a third term. So he was in office ready to preside over the events of 7/7. And a couple of years later, he buggered off and gave the job to Gordon Brown. Job done. So we're going to take our break now for about 15 minutes or so. But if there's one way of summing up everything that we've learned from part one, it comes from the words of the late, great George Carlin. Oh, how we miss him. Well, I certainly do. Could certainly do with him around in these times to offer some commentary on the madness of it all. But back in the day, he quite simply observed,
"It's a big club, and you ain't in it."
What I want to get into now is the punk and new wave scene. Because there are so many genres, you know, I systematically destroy people's attachments to their favourite scenes and their favourite bands and such, you know. So if I've not got round to your particular favourite yet, please bear with me. I will get around to it. So we're going genre by genre. I've pissed off hip-hop fans. I've pissed off electronic dance music fans. Now I'm going to piss off the punk rockers, okay? So when it comes to the punk and new wave scene, it really doesn't disappoint in terms of the way it's been used to push agendas and also the connections that we find back to the world of the military. Again, I learned a lot about punk and new wave from Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill on those Unspun podcasts. They did one show where they broke down the etymology of the word punk, because it seems a pretty good way to start, right? If we're looking at the genre. So various definitions of the word punk include a young man used as a homosexual partner, especially in prison. An aggressive and violent young man. An inexperienced young person. A cowardly or weak young man. An inferior, rotten, worthless person or thing. A petty criminal or hoodlum. So keep that in mind the next time you call yourself a punk. It's rather like fans of the Grateful Dead being referred to as deadheads. You'll have a whole load of people going around saying, yeah, man, I'm a punk. Maybe you're not. Maybe you don't want to be. There were various cultural heroes of the punk and new wave scene. Many of them were also revered by the artists of the 60s counterculture, and they included the so-called beat poets of the 1950s and 60s. So it's William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, people like that, and this guy, Allen Ginsberg, complete degenerate. He was a member of the North American Man-Boy-Love Association. This is an organisation which campaigns for grown men to be able to have sex with young boys without penalty. So, great hero. As I mentioned, various locations seem to be intrinsically tied to certain genres. And when it comes to punk, the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan, New York, has a lot to answer for. Lots of legends attached to this place. Many playwrights and authors and musicians have holed themselves up in this place from time to time. There are rumours of satanic rituals which take place in the basement. It's said to be a CIA MKUltra mind control stronghold. And it's also the place where Sid Vicious is said to have stabbed to death his girlfriend Nancy Spungen on the 12th of October 1978. Which just happens to be the birth date of Aleister Crowley, the notorious occultist. It's interesting that both the British and American versions of the punk scene were centred around districts called Chelsea. So there's Chelsea, New York, and there was Chelsea, London, and it was in the King's Road, Chelsea, that Malcolm McLaren shared a boutique called Sex with Vivienne Westwood, his partner, no relation to Tim Westwood, as far as I know, although it wouldn't surprise me. So this pair ran this shop, which is credited with having made punk fashions very cool in the mid-1970s. There's Malcolm with his T-shirt, which says Cambridge Rapist on it. Cool slogan. And so the Sex Pistols were put together by Malcolm McLaren in pretty much the same way as a boy band would be. You know, patched together, various members from here and there. The two most prominent members of that group were the aforementioned Sid Vicious, real name John Simon Ritchie, and he was so punk rock that his parents met when they both served in the British Royal Air Force. And his father also worked for a time as a Beefeater guardsman outside Buckingham Palace. Punk rock, man. Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, published an autobiography called Anger is an Energy, where he spoke of having attended kinky late-night sex parties at the House of Commons, where he saw various prominent British MPs in compromising positions with call girls and rent boys. But what he didn't adequately explain is what he himself was doing at these parties. The Sex Pistols' rivals, it says here, were the Clash. This is Joe Strummer, one of the prominent members of the Clash, real name John Graham Mellor. His father, Ronald Mellor, who I think was a KBE, was a British diplomat attached to the Foreign Office, an aspect of government. The other main member of the Clash, and also Big Audio Dynamite, was Mick Jones. You might wonder why he's being pictured side by side with Grant Shapps, the treacherous former Transport Secretary in Boris Johnson's cabinet. It's because they're cousins. So the Clash might not be perhaps as working class grassroots as you've been led to believe they are, given all these connections into government. This is Bernie Rhodes, the manager of the Clash, and he was a situationist. He was into this avant-garde, anarchist, highbrow intellectual art movement, which came out of France, called Situationist International. Here's a bit more about it. So SI is described as an international organisation of social revolutionaries made up of avant-garde artists, intellectuals and political theorists. The interesting thing is that Malcolm McLaren was also a situationist, as was Tony Wilson, the proprietor of Factory Records in Manchester, out of which we got Joy Division and New Order and the Hacienda nightclub. So we got all these prominent music industry managers who all adhere to this avant-garde art movement. This is one of the main groups to have come out of the New York version of the punk scene, Talking Heads, and there was a side project called the Tom Tom Club, which was headed up by the husband and wife duo of Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth. Let's have a look at some family connections there, shall we? So Tina Weymouth's brother Jan, who was a Harvard graduate, of course, turns out to have been chief of design for the Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei on the Grand Louvre project in Paris, involving the placement of the iconic glass pyramid. The family's Masonic links seem to be represented here, given the symbolism incorporated into the Louvre and into one of the most Masonic cities on earth. Jan also designed the Salvador Dali Museum and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and was awarded the National Order of Merit from France. Meanwhile, his sister's in a punk band. What about their father, Ralph Weymouth? Well, here we go. Stop me if you've heard this one before. He was a Vice Admiral of the US Navy and a Master of the Freemason Grand Lodge of Maine. And we've got all these other connections here to the Astor Place Bank, the Federal Reserve System, Skull and Bones at Yale. Not necessarily the sort of background you'd expect from punk band musicians, is it? Very soon, as I've announced on Sheep Farm, when I've been having conversations with Dom and Chris on there, I'm going to put out a presentation titled, No One's Dad's a Plumber. Because when it comes to rock musicians, before I got into this research, I would have assumed that the dads of many band members would have been builders, plumbers, lorry drivers, dockers, construction workers, you know, things of this nature. Working class jobs. You don't find that. I challenge you. Find me a prominent rock star whose dad's a plumber. What you do find is politicians, statesmen, admirals, generals, lord mayors, plenty of them, university lecturers, things of this nature. It's a bit strange, isn't it? Fair few spies as well, as it turns out. Which leads us to the Copeland family. If you wanted to make it big as a band on the punk and new wave scene, in its heyday, late 1970s, going into the 80s, you pretty much had to go through the Copelands. They were the gatekeepers of the scene. There were three brothers, Ian Copeland on the left, now deceased. In the middle, you might recognise the drummer with the group The Police, Stuart Copeland. And on the right, Miles Copeland Jr. They were the sons of a CIA agent who was a legend in intelligence circles, Miles Axe Copeland. So all three of his sons were born in Beirut, which is a major CIA stronghold, and they were all put to use in the music industry. They ran various companies like record labels, artist management companies. They had a show on MTV where they would only showcase artists signed to their own roster. And they used to like to give the odd clue every now and again as to their connections. So they had a sort of holding company for all their various activities, which they called Copeland International Artists, or CIA. They also had a record label, which they called Frontier Booking International. A record label called International Records Syndicate. And then, of course, there was their house band, the Police. As in, they were there to police all the other groups on the scene. That was their job. The Police, featuring Sting, as in a sting operation. What's a sting operation? It's one that takes you by surprise and you never see it coming. The group MC5, Motor City 5, out of Detroit, had two members, Wayne Kramer and Michael Davis, who were both inmates at the Federal Medicine Center in Lexington, Kentucky, known initially as the United States Narcotic Farm, but revealed to have been one of the major hospitals involved in the CIA's MKUltra drug experimentation program. William Burroughs, the beat poet, also attended the same hospital. Within punk and new wave, which is why it's such a fun scene to look into, and in Musical Truth Volume 2 I've got a whole chapter on this, we even get links to serial killers. This is just one. This is Debbie Harry of Blondie, who claims that she narrowly missed becoming an early victim of Ted Bundy when she says that she accepted a lift from him in New York City, but something about him started to bother her and creep her out, and she very quickly got out of the car. We can ask ourselves how true that story really is and what the odds are of someone that would go on to become as famous as her rubbing shoulders with a famous serial killer, particularly when we factor in some other stories. And then critical thinking has to kick in, and we have to ask whether we're being led up the garden path here. So this one involves Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders, who went on to marry Jim Kerr of Simple Minds. And in 1970, she claims that she was a student at Kent State University. And this was the site of the infamous Kent State Massacre, where the National Guard opened fire on a bunch of students that had been protesting and demonstrating there on the campus, killing several of them. There's also a member of the group Devo, which stands for Devolution, who claims he was present at that event that day as well. So you might say, well, yeah, it's possible, could have happened. But the more stories of this nature we get, the more we have to ask ourselves what the odds really are. So on the winter solstice of 1988, 21st of December of that year, this Pan Am jet came down over Lockerbie in the Scottish borders, killing everyone on board. We get the story that many famous people that we all know were due to have been on that flight, but narrowly escaped death. Among them, Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols. He says that he was due to be on that flight, but his wife took so long packing their suitcase that they missed their ride to the airport and they had to book themselves on a later flight. The Four Tops, who'd been in London recording a performance for Top of the Pops, say that their performance overran and so they were late getting back to the airport and they missed the flight. Otherwise, no more Four Tops. And Kim Cattrall, the actress from Sex and the City, says, you'll love this one, she took so long trying to find the right teapot in Harrods to bring back as a present for her mother, couldn't decide between those teapots, and as a result, she was late getting to the airport and she missed the flight. I think this accounts to more satanic mockery of what they perceive to be the profanity of the masses. They love feeding us horse shit stories like this. They're still doing it to this day. But then again, we get stories involving others which may be slightly different in nature. So another event which really finished off the ideals of the 1960s happened right at the end of that decade, December 1969. And it was the infamous Altamont concert featuring the Rolling Stones. This was an event where 4 young people died, including one 18-year-old lad, Meredith Hunter, who was stabbed to death by the Hells Angels, who were doing security at that gig. So that went well then. And that event was caught on film by a budding young filmmaker. His name was George Lucas. Nothing will ever come of him. Many researchers feel that that event, which was basically a snuff movie, would have served as some sort of initiation into the upper echelons of the industry for George Lucas, effectively kick-starting his Hollywood film career, which took off shortly afterwards. As well as lifetime actors, we have what I refer to as extracurricular activities. So this is where you have people who are supposed to be pop stars or actors or whatever it is, but they seem to spend more of their time doing stuff that you wouldn't associate them with than being pop stars or actors or whatever. I mean, Bono is a good example. Take Bono. No, please, take Bono. And take Geldof with him while you're about it. I refer to him as Bonzo because he always sounds like a dog, a pet dog, you know. Here, Bonzo, come on, boy. And he is a little lapdog poodle of the Illuminati, effectively. So Bono spends a lot of his time hanging out with the likes of Bill Gates and Bill Clinton, Obama, the Pope. Why should that be if Bono's just a rock singer, you know? The truth is, he's a bit more than just a rock singer. He's a lifetime actor with extracurricular activities. And another one is Will.i.am, or as I refer to him, Shill.i.am, of the Black Eyed Peas. His job through that group and as a producer of electronic music has been to glorify transhumanism, the merging of humanity and technology, and giving young people who listen to his music, God only knows why anyone would, but apparently some people do, the idea that digital electronic ways of doing things are really good, really great for the future. But he's also been named as an ambassador for artificial intelligence to the World Economic Forum. So he goes up there to Davos, hangs out at those meetings with Klaus Schwab and them. Here he is at one such meeting. There's Leonardo DiCaprio next to Blofeld. What are they doing there? They're supposed to be pop stars and actors. Well, they're more than just that. And the idea with them is, again, you build a fan base. So with Leo DiCaprio, loads of people have seen him in films and they think, oh, I like him. He's a good actor. Yeah, he's a nice man. I like him. So when he pops up at meetings like this and starts pushing WEF propaganda, a lot of people who aren't engaging critical thought are likely to go, oh, right, yeah, well, if he's endorsing that, it's probably a good idea. It's probably something I need to get behind. That's why they do it. Extracurricular activities. Never trust a sir. If they're sir this or sir that, give them a wide berth and you'll never go far wrong. Blanket statement. So every now and again with one of these famous people, the phone will ring. And on the other end, somebody will say, get your ass down to the recording studio tomorrow. You're filming an ad or an announcement for whatever it is. A lot of the bands that took part in the Band Aid Do They Know It's Christmas record said that about Bob Geldof, which is an interesting thing. I've seen a few documentaries where some of the pop stars that were on that record said, well, the phone rang and it was Bob Geldof, and he said, get your ass down to the recording studio Sunday morning, you're going to be on this record, and you don't say no to Bob Geldof. Well, why not? Bob Geldof is supposed to be just a scruffy, out-of-tune singer for some random Irish new wave band, right? It's pretty clear that he was always more than that. And it's borne out by statements like, you don't say no to Bob Geldof. I mean, Boy George was in New York the night before that record was recorded. He'd been out on a bender, he was wasted, and Geldof sent a Concorde over to pick him up and whisk him back and take him straight to the studio. He was like, you're on the record, be there. You don't say no. So it would have been this way with all these traitors who pushed the tyranny and the nonsense of the past 3 or 4 years. Sir Elton. He wouldn't have had a choice. When you've had a career lasting as long as his, and you've had all the fame and the wealth and the sports cars and the mansions and the women and boys, maybe, depending on your preferences, this comes at a price. And when that instruction comes to make an announcement such as this, you don't get to say no.
My name is Elton John.
Cut there. Little less showbiz, Elton.
My name is Elton John.
Bit more showbiz.
My name is Elton John.
Let's go for your Michael Caine impression. Just let's see what it's like.
My name is Elton John.
Beautiful. Cut there.
The more people in society that get vaccinated, the more chance there is of eradicating the national COVID pandemic.
Stop me if you've heard that one before. Now, he wasn't the only Sir on that ad. And he's lying, by the way. His name ain't Elton John. It's Reg Dwight. Here's the other one. Let's see what he had to say, shall we?
I've just had a vaccine for COVID.
Well, you haven't.
It didn't hurt. Not many people know that.
Sir Maurice Micklewhite. By the same token, you don't get to have a career lasting as long as this guy's. Multiple decades with however many films he's made. Household name, again, try the experiment. Go and stop 10 people in the street. Have you heard of Michael Caine? 10 out of 10, yes. Well then, he's been placed there. Didn't work his way up under his own steam. He was given that career. But it comes at a price. That's the price. You don't have a mind that you can call your own. And this one was particularly disgusting for me. Another Sir. Is it just me or is there a pattern forming here? So when they were trying to get everyone to take one of these arm spears, well, more than one, there were certain groups in society that were very reticent to go for it. The Asian community and the black community. I can't imagine why Asian people and black people would be suspicious of the white elite establishment. You know, why would that be? But the take-up was very low in these groups. So it was decided that they needed to have some of their own trying to entice them into doing the right thing and going and taking one of these things. So there was an Asian version of it, and they had celebrities like the Goodness Gracious Me crew, you know. And then there was one for black people, and it had Beverly Knight on it. It was so disappointing. And, of course, Sir Lenny Henry. And they didn't waste the opportunities afforded by this one for tying it in with a couple of other agendas and sort of putting them all together into one big melting pot. So this is what this one sounded like.
Don't let their sacrifice be in vain. Don't let your concerns be the thing that widens racial inequality in our society.
Don't let coronavirus cost even more black lives. Because we matter.
2 psyops for the price of 1, eh? So Black Lives Matter gets thrown in with Convid, and it's all one big homogenised mess, you know? Particularly disgusting. Then we have more sirs being wheeled out, all on track with the same message, all on script, not one of them deviating, apart from Van Morrison, Eric Clapton, Ian Brown, and Right Said Fred. When Right Said Fred have become the political activists for a generation, something has gone badly wrong. So here he is, Sir Billy Shears, William Campbell, who says, be cool, get vaxxed. Well, he doesn't, because it's not him. I mean, I don't think that's even the replacement. It's just some random bastard in a beanie and a mask. Could be anyone. Sir Mick Jagger, lifetime actor, hits out at anti-vaxxers. You can't argue with these people, he says. Well, you can't argue with your bosses. Especially when you pop up in Jeffrey Epstein's little black book. Mick Jagger's in there, Tony Blair. That's a surprise, isn't it? Richard Branson. Stephen Hawking was in that book. How? I don't even want to think about how he got down. Anyway, there were about 8 Stephen Hawkings, so it's a question of which one it was. And a lifetime actor's work is never done, and sometimes it can be decades later before they reveal their true colours. So Spotify hosted a podcast by Joe Rogan where he featured Dr. Robert Malone questioning the efficacy of the Convid arm spears. Neil Young didn't like that, and he wanted Spotify to remove the podcast. And he said, if you don't take that podcast off of Spotify, I'm pulling all my music. Nothing says freedom like a musician telling you you can't listen to Keep On Rockin' in the Free World anymore. And then Joni Mitchell joined him in solidarity by saying she was going to do the same. So 50 odd years after they first emerged, they're still pushing agendas. And speaking of agendas, let's bring it all the way up to date. This is what modern hip-hop looks like. This is a rapper, I use the term very loosely, called, can you guess his name? Young Thug. Dressed up as Little Bo Peep. In a dress. This is what that culture is being used to push these days. Transgenderism, the whole LGBTQ agenda, because that's what it is a social engineering agenda cooked up at Tavistock. I know a thing or two about rap and hip-hop culture and the mentality of those that are into it. I came up in that scene. In the mid-90s, if a rapper had come out dressed as Little Bo Peep, he would have been shot. Not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying he would have been shot. That would not have been tolerated. These days, no problem. That's the slow drip creep of incremental steps in social engineering. Little by little, totalitarian tiptoe, David Icke would call it, they do it very gradually so you don't notice the changes, the boiling frog in the pot syndrome. Here's Lil Wayne in the video to his song, Love Me. And for no apparent reason, he turns into a demon, like you do. So when they're not pushing transgenderism, they're pushing blatant Satanism. This is at the point in the record where he says, these hoes love me like Satan, man. Not quite sure why the hoes loved Satan in the first place, but apparently they did. Here's Lil Nas X, and this is like sacrilege to 90s hip-hop because one of the biggest rappers in that decade was Nas. And this guy's called Lil Nas X, so it's like he's pissing all over everything that Nas stood for in his heritage and his legacy. And this guy's pushing Satanism again. He put out a shoe. So as well as doing the one eye symbol that we see so often here, he's got a Nike shoe, which we were told contains real human blood. And it's put out there as a product, and everyone thinks it's just fine. No uproar, no problem with it. Kids are buying it, no problem. And by the time you get to a so-called rapper who goes by the name of New Age Jerk Boy, and he appears in his video in a wedding dress with rainbow-coloured hair, giving fellatio to a machine gun, all hope for humanity has been lost. These are contemporary agendas. They come out of the likes of Tavistock, and this is the way society now looks. Because people have allowed it, basically. The sad cat meme. That face you make when you realise all the personal heroes you used to look up to were just lifetime actors on the payroll all along. The Who, not Ted Ross's lot, Pete Townshend's lot, had a song, Won't Get Fooled Again. And this song spoke to the dynamic of social engineering and cultural creation. They said, there's nothing in the street looks any different to me, and the slogans are effaced by the by. And the parting on the left is now the parting on the right, and the beards have all grown longer overnight. This has to become a mantra for all of us. Won't get fooled again. There's a famous phrase, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, because we're supposed to learn from these things. And we've had more than enough opportunity to learn about what's been done to us over decades and centuries through these dynamics. Last word goes to the group The Stranglers, who put out a song titled No More Heroes. And I would simply add to that 3 more words. At all, ever. So my presentations tend to be about 99.9% doom and dread, and I save the 0.01% of optimism and positivity for the last 30 seconds or so, So we're at that point now, and there is reason for positivity, I feel. And it simply comes from the fact that we are now able to know this information. We're now able to comprehend the methods and the tactics that have been weaponized against us. We're not supposed to, but that's what happens when you invent something like the internet, intended to surveil and monitor and control. There's always going to be collateral damage on the part of the psychopathic controllers. And that's going to involve the free sharing of information and communication between people that want to discover truth, that want to take personal responsibility for their own lives, their own behaviours and actions and thoughts. And so when you do, and you exercise your free will in that direction, you can know this stuff. And this information is now getting out there. People are really getting to grips with this stuff. There are books, there are YouTube videos, lectures and talks such as this. One way or another, the old tricks aren't working the way they used to. We're breaking the mind control spells. And this has to continue so that it reaches an exponential rate. We can all play our part in that. We can't all write books and do talks and stuff like that, but we can all speak to people. We can all play our own personal individual role in getting information of this nature out there. And not just about music and popular culture and entertainment. There's information getting out there now about the true nature of certain medical interventions, the true nature of the financial money system, the true nature of government, secret societies, the world of the occult, and it's all connected. All these pieces fit together. This is my individual personal contribution to things. I talk about all this stuff. The next speaker might talk about the machinations of the banking industry, and that's their contribution, their piece of the puzzle. We put all these pieces together and eventually the big picture emerges. And we will reach a point where the old lies and the old secrets just won't wash anymore. Things are only headed in one direction, and it's really bad news for psychopathic, satanic controllers. Rather better news for the rest of humanity. Thanks for listening.